My brother pointed at me beside my mother's casket and told 40 people that I ruined this family. I didn't say a single word back. I just stood there in my black suit that still smelled faintly of dry cleaner's plastic, and I let him speak because I already knew what he didn't. My mother had left me a letter, sealed, dated, waiting in a drawer at the funeral home office for this exact moment. And it was about to unravel everything he thought he understood about the last 6 years of our lives. My name is Walter. I am 66 years old. I run a small furniture restoration shop on Peoria Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It is the kind of shop that smells of linseed oil and sawdust, where it takes 3 weeks to refinish a rocking chair because I am not in a hurry. I've always believed that if you just keep quietly doing the right thing, eventually people will see it. I was wrong about the timing. For 6 years, nobody saw what I was doing except my wife, my mother, and a hospice nurse named Renee, who still came by every February on my mother's birthday to call me. Everyone else saw exactly what my brother wanted them to see. I will never forget that moment standing by the grave, the Oklahoma wind blowing hard against the funeral tent. My brother Roland's voice cracking like he was grieving, but he wasn't. I'll get to that moment first. I need you to understand what came before it, because the letter in that drawer didn't just answer an accusation, it answered 6 years of them. Let me tell you from the beginning. My mother's name was Eleanor Doss. She was 89 years old when she passed away in April at the house on Zuni Street in Brookside, the house she and my father bought in 1968 for $19,500, back when Brookside was still mostly vacant lots and birch trees. My father died in 2011 from a heart attack in the garage, a wrench still in his hand, fixing a lawn mower that didn't need as much fixing as he thought. My mother lived alone in that house for 8 years after that, stubborn as a fence post, refusing every offer to move to a smaller place, somewhere with an emergency call button on a lanyard. Roland is 3 years older than me. He moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, in 1994 to build a real estate investment firm, Doss Capital Partners. By the time our mother started needing help, he had a house with a kidney-shaped pool and a wife named Denise, who drove a white Range Rover and posted photos online with captions like, "Blessed." I don't say that to be cruel, I say it because it matters for what happened later. Comfort can make a person remarkably distant from the people who actually need them. In late 2018, my mother fell in the kitchen. Nothing broke, but she was scared, and I was even more scared. That evening, I drove over to Zuni Street and found her sitting on the floor rug, holding a bag of frozen peas against her hip, looking more ashamed than hurt, insisting she didn't need an ambulance, insisting she was fine, and insisting it in a voice so frail it broke my heart. That was the beginning. Not a dramatic start, but a very quiet one, the kind nobody puts in a photo album. My wife, Carol, a retired nurse who worked 30 years at St. Francis Hospital, took one look at my mother's blood pressure log and pill organizer, half the compartments out of place, and said what I had been avoiding. "Walt, she needs someone checking on her every single day. Not someday, but right now." I called Roland that week. I remember exactly where I was standing in my shop, holding the phone jammed against my shoulder. I told him about the fall, the pill box, and the blood pressure readings Carol didn't like. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Walt, I have 3 deals closing this quarter. I can't just drop everything. Can you keep an eye on her for a bit? I'll pull my weight." I said, "Sure." I want you to pay attention to that word sure, because I've thought about it 100 times since. It cost nothing to say, and in the end, it cost me 6 years of Tuesdays. Now, 6 years is a long time. I want to tell you what those years actually looked like, because most families who go through this never get a chance to explain it to anyone who understands. It wasn't a series of dramatic emergencies. It was a routine. At 6:15 every morning before opening the shop at 9 o'clock, I drove my old Ford into the driveway on Zuni's Avenue. I went in through the kitchen door. She never locked it, no matter how many times I asked, and found her already awake, sitting at the table in her bathrobe waiting for coffee. I started making the coffee because her hands were too shaky to use the coffee maker by 2020. I sorted her morning medication into the plastic box: lysinopril, furosemide, potassium supplements, metoprolol for her heart rate, and watched her swallow every single pill, because Carol had taught me that watching was more important than trusting. Some mornings she was sharp, asking about a piece of furniture I was restoring, a walnut sideboard or a church pew someone wanted turned into a hallway bench. Other mornings, especially after 2021, she called me by my father's name, Frank, without even realizing it. I learned not to correct her, just to answer. Carol came over most afternoons, checking her blood pressure, checking her ankles for swelling, the telltale sign that her heart failure was creeping back. She used a stethoscope to listen to her lungs, keeping it in the glove box of her Buick, where other retirees kept sunglasses. She never complained once. About 18 months into it, I asked her if she resented giving up so many afternoons that were supposed to be ours. She looked at me like I had asked a foolish question. "Walt," she said, "this is marriage. Did you think I married you just for the easy years?" Roland called every few weeks, sometimes less. I want to be fair to him. Those calls were real. He asked genuine questions. Was she eating? Was she sleeping? Did we need anything ordered and delivered? He sent a heated blanket in the winter of 2020 and a new recliner in 2022. What he never did, not once in 6 years, was ask how I was doing. No offers of a relief stint, not even a Sunday afternoon off. I told myself it was fine. When people ask later how something like this goes on so long without anyone stepping in, the answer is that it never feels like a single grand decision. It just feels like a Tuesday, then another Tuesday, then a Thursday. Years pass in Tuesdays. We didn't talk to anyone about it as if it were a sacrifice. At the time, it didn't feel like one. It just felt like being her son. Birthday cards from Roland arrived reliably. Always signed with love, Roland, Denise, and the kids. Even though his kids were grown and mostly gone by then, he visited twice a year, usually around the holidays, flying in for 2 or 3 days, taking her out to the Cheesecake Factory at Utica Square, posting a picture with a caption about how family is everything, and then flying back to Scottsdale. I never said anything to him about the imbalance for all those years. I want you to think about that, because it mattered later. I never picked up the phone to say, "You need to do more." I told myself it wasn't a competition, that his presence wasn't a debt he owed me, and that my mother didn't measure love in miles traveled. Looking back, I think I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke up. A part of me already knew how he would flip the narrative. In the spring of 2019, something changed that I didn't understand until much later. Roland flew in for what he called a quick visit. 2 days, no holiday attached. He took my mother out to lunch alone, just the two of them, no Denise, which was unusual. When I dropped by that evening to check her medication, she was quieter than usual. Not sad exactly, but cautious. The way a person gets when they're turning something over in their head and haven't decided what to do with it. I asked her if everything was all right. She patted my hand and said, "Roland just wanted to talk business. Sweetheart, nothing to worry about. I handled it." That was my second mistake, though it took 5 years to realize it. That night in bed, listening to the ceiling fan tick, I told Carol about it. "Something was off today," I said. Roland took her to lunch, and afterward she was different, quiet, careful. Carol said, "Maybe it is nothing, Walt. Maybe he just told her something about his business." I remember agreeing with her, mostly because it was easier than listening to my own gut. My mother never mentioned that lunch again for the rest of her life, not once in 6 years. That alone should have told me something. Here is the truth about caring for an aging parent. It doesn't happen in dramatic scenes. It happens in 1,000 small ones that wear you down so slowly you don't even notice your own shape changing until you look at old photos and realize how much you've aged in years that blurred together like a long gray hallway. I missed my granddaughter's school play in 2021 because my mother had a urinary tract infection that sent her fever spiking, leaving her confused and terrified for 11 long hours. I canceled an anniversary trip to Eureka Springs in 2022 because her cardiologist wanted to adjust her medications, and I didn't trust anyone else to monitor the side effects. Carol never grumbled, not once in 6 years. That is the woman I married. By early 2023, my mother's heart was failing. Stage C congestive heart failure. In the doctor's terms, her cardiologist at St. Francis told us fluid was accumulating in her lungs, no matter how carefully we managed her sodium and diuretics. We brought in hospice care that November. A nurse named Renee started coming 3 times a week, then every day within a month, and eventually staying overnight on several occasions, so Carol and I could finally sleep in our own bed instead of the recliner in my mother's living room. Those final 5 months are the part of this story I hold closest, and the part least understood. I learned the distinct sound of her breathing when fluid gathered. A heavy, wet rhythm that the hospice manual called shine. Stokes breathing, though none of us used that name out loud, we just called it the hard breathing. Through those long nights, I kept the small oxygen machine humming in the corner of her bedroom, a sound I still hear sometimes in quiet moments at my shop. Grief doesn't wait politely for the funeral. It arrives piece by piece months earlier, like the way a mother's hand feels lighter in yours with every passing week. Roland flew in twice during those 5 months, staying 3 days each time, sitting by her bed and holding her hand. I want to be clear about this, because it matters. Those visits weren't meaningless. She beamed both times he visited. Through that door, she beamed just like she did when I was a kid whenever my father came home from a long trip. I don't deny that. I never have. What I know for sure is that between those 2 visits, I called him every time something changed, every hospital admission, every medication adjustment, every night. Renee's face told me more than her words did. I kept a call log if anyone wants to see it, and as it turns out, someone eventually did. There was someone else besides me and Carol who showed up all those years. I want to introduce her now because she matters more than almost anyone else in this story. My niece, Paige, Denise's daughter, was 27 when my mother died. She grew up mostly in Arizona, but she came back to Tulsa to attend nursing school at the University of Oklahoma's Tulsa campus. Being close to her grandmother again seemed to mean far more to her than it ever did to her father. Paige started dropping by the house on Zuni Street on her own. Naturally, sometimes twice a week, bringing crossword books for my mother and sitting through afternoon television shows. My mother never made a fuss about it, and Paige never posted about it online. She just showed up the same way I showed up, and I noticed. My mother noticed too, and that noticing would come to mean a great deal just 10 minutes later in this story. My mother passed away on a Tuesday morning in April at home, in her bed on Zuni Street, with Renee on one side and me on the other. Carol was holding her feet, the way you hold the feet of someone who spent her life serving others. It was quiet. In a way, it was exactly the kind of ending she would have chosen if anyone had asked her to plan it. I called Roland from the front yard before the funeral home arrived. He didn't cry on that call. I remember that clearly because of what happened 4 days later. I didn't know it yet, but my mother had made one more decision about all of this months earlier. She had written something down with her lawyer, and she hadn't told a soul about its contents. Not me, not Carol, and not Paige. She sealed it, gave it to a woman named Diane Patterson, and gave precise instructions on when and how it should be opened. I was completely in the dark. I was about to find out at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, standing right beside the casket, while my brother pointed his finger at my chest. The service was held at Fitzgerald and Sons Funeral Home on Riverside Drive, a place my mother had chosen herself years ago when she walked along the drive with my father before he died. The two of them treated that errand like picking a hotel for a trip neither really wanted to take, but both understood was coming. About 40 people came, neighbors from Brookside who had known her for 40 years, ladies from her Tuesday Bridge group, mostly in their 80s, moving slowly and carefully through the parking lot, and Renee, who showed up after her shift in a simple gray dress instead of scrubs. I almost didn't recognize her out of uniform until she hugged me, and I felt that familiar calmness she always brought into that house. Roland flew in the night before with Denise. Paige drove her own car from her apartment near campus, arriving early to sit with Carol and me in the family room before the doors opened. Her eyes were red, rimmed, and her hand found mine, holding tight the way you hold onto something solid, when the ground beneath you feels unsteady. I gave the eulogy. I hadn't planned on speaking, but the funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Halloway, had asked during the family meeting the day before if either son wished to speak. Roland had said without hesitation, "Walt should do it. he was around her more. I remembered that line clearly because of how different it sounded when I recalled it less than 24 hours later. Looking back, there were signs during that family meeting, small ones, the kind you only recognize after the story has ended. Roland flipped through the casket catalog at a speed I found strange at the time, picking the mahogany one, upgrading the flower package, without asking anyone else, and telling Mr. Halloway he wanted the obituary to mention Doss Capital Partners, so his business associates in Scottsdale would understand why he might need to leave a day early. Nobody said anything. I remember Aunt Ruth's eyebrows raising just a bit before dropping back down quickly. I spoke about her coffee, weak, terrible, and exactly how she liked it. I spoke about how she used to stand at the kitchen window on Zuni Street, narrating the neighborhood like a play meant only for her. That Henderson boy is speeding again. Somebody ought to say something. I spoke about my father's garage and the lawnmower he never quite finished fixing, and I said I thought some part of my mother had been quietly fixing things for us all along, just as silently, just as stubbornly. People laughed at the right moments. People cried at the right moments. I sat down next to Carol and, for a second, felt like the hardest part was over. It wasn't after the graveside service under a green tent that did almost nothing against the relentless Oklahoma wind, trying to blow over the flower arrangements. The funeral director invited the immediate family to stay behind for a few minutes before everyone moved to the reception room. It was just us, me, Carol, Roland, Denise, Paige, and Aunt Ruth, my mother's 84-year-old sister who leaned on a cane with a worn rubber tip. Roland stepped up to the casket, and for a second I thought he was going to say something about our mother, something gentle, something final. Instead, he turned around and looked straight at me. His voice rang out loud enough that people 20 feet away, walking toward their cars, actually stopped in their tracks. "I hope you are proud of yourself, Walt," he said. I remember the sheer cruelty in his calm voice as he said it. "You spent 6 years cutting me out of Mom's life, feeding her whatever stories you wanted her to believe. And now you stand there reading sweet words like you were the only son who loved her. You ruined this family. You did this, not me." I want to be honest about how I felt right then. People expect me to say I was furious, but I wasn't. Not right away. It felt more like disorientation. That specific vertigo you get when the reality of what you've done for 6 years is described back to you in a shape you don't even recognize. I stood there in the wind, 4 feet from my mother's casket, and truthfully, I couldn't get a single word out. Carol's hand gripped my arm. Aunt Ruth's mouth pressed into a thin line. Paige stared at her father as if she had never seen him before in her life, which in a way, maybe she hadn't. Denise looked down at the grass. "Roland," I finally managed to say, my voice much quieter than his. I think my quietness caught him off guard more than if I had shouted, "This isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," he said. "You had her to yourself for 6 years, and now you get to stand there like the hero. I flew in whenever I could. I called her constantly, and somehow I ended up the villain in whatever version you sold her." I didn't argue with him. I want to make that clear because it matters for everything that followed. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list the mornings, the pillboxes, or the 11-hour fever where she called me by my father's name. I just stood there and let him say it in front of my aunt, in front of my niece, and right in front of the wind blowing the flowers on my mother's casket. A part of me, even then, understood that arguing with him right there would only give the moment more definition, more life, and turn it into exactly what he wanted. I stayed silent when everything inside me wanted to set the record straight. I've thought a lot about that moment since. I think that silence was the only decent thing I had left to offer. I didn't know yet that I wouldn't need to defend myself much longer. As we walked back toward the cars, Mr. Halloway, the funeral director, gently touched my elbow and said softly, "Just between us, Mr. Doss, your mother left something with us, an envelope. She was very specific about the timing. She wanted it handed to you after the service, in front of the family, at the reception, not a moment before. I have it locked in my desk drawer. I just wanted you to know it exists, so you wouldn't be shocked when I bring it out." I nodded and said, "Thank you." I walked toward the reception hall with a strange, cold sensation creeping into my chest. The specific feeling of realizing something is about to happen that you can neither stop nor yet fully understand. The reception room at Fitzgerald & Sons was a simple space with round tables, coffee carafes, and a long table along the back wall covered in casseroles and pies brought by Brookside neighbors, because food is the only language some people have for grief. I stood near the door with a paper cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, watching Roland accept condolences from my mother's bridge friends with that practiced, mournful nod that I realized he had probably used before. Mr. Halloway found me about 20 minutes later. He held a brown envelope in his hands. My mother's handwriting was on the front, written carefully with a slightly shaky cursive she had developed in the last 2 years of her life. For Walter, below it, a note specified that the envelope was to be opened at the reception in the presence of the family and not a moment before. I didn't mean to make a scene. By nature, I am not a man who likes making a scene, but my mother had left explicit instructions that this envelope be opened with the family present. Standing there with the envelope in my hands, I understood that she had planned this moment with the same quiet care she had brought to everything else in her life. Years before, whatever was inside was meant to settle things once and for all. I asked Mr. Halloway if I could have a moment to gather the family. He nodded and stepped back. I found Carol first, and she squeezed my hand once without speaking, because 30 years of marriage meant she already understood I needed to do this myself. I told Paige to stand near me. I told Aunt Ruth, who placed her cane against the nearest table and crossed her arms over her chest, as if bracing for something, even though she couldn't have known what it was. Then, because my mother had addressed the family, I walked over to where Roland stood with Denise near the coffee urn and said quietly, "Mom left something behind. She wanted it opened here in front of everyone." Roland's expression grew complex. For a fraction of a second, I saw something cross his face that I later realized was closer to fear than curiosity. Then it returned to the composed, sorrowful demeanor he had carried all morning. "Whatever it is, Walt," he said, loud enough for a few people to turn their heads, "I hope it is the truth." I opened the envelope. Inside was a multi-page handwritten letter on the yellow legal pad paper my mother kept in her kitchen drawer for grocery lists and phone messages, along with a second, smaller sealed envelope with Paige's name written on it. I unfolded the letter. I recognized her handwriting from thousands of birthday cards and grocery lists, the script firmer here than in her final years, telling me she had written this long before it was needed. I read the letter out loud. Every single word mattered, and I think my mother, in her own quiet way, wanted it heard exactly like this in a room full of the people involved. It began to my family. "If you are hearing these words read aloud, then I am gone. I imagine some of you are standing closer to each other than others, and I imagine I know exactly why. I want to start by saying what I should have said years ago while I still could. Walter, you took care of me every single day for 6 years without ever asking me to notice. I noticed every morning you showed up before your shop opened. I noticed every time Carol checked my blood pressure with that familiar, patient face she probably used with strangers for 30 years at the hospital. I noticed the anniversary trip you and Carol canceled in 2022, because I overheard you two talking about Eureka Springs in the kitchen, and I heard you decide to stay without a single complaint. I was not confused during those years, as some of you might have thought. I was tired. There is a difference, and I want that distinction recorded." The room became completely still. I could hear the hum of the coffee maker behind me. I kept reading. "Roland," the letter continued, "I need to explain something now that I never dared say to your face because I didn't want to lose you. I was afraid that speaking directly would cost me the only version of you I still had access to. The twice-a-year visits and the phone calls every few weeks." I felt the room shift. I saw Denise's hand freeze on her coffee cup. I saw Roland's jaw clench in a way I recognized from every argument between us as boys 50 years ago, in a house that no longer belonged to either of us. In April 2019, my mother's letter continued, "You visited me alone, and during lunch at the Cheesecake Factory, you told me you were worried about my financial management. You asked me to sign papers adding your name as a co-owner to my primary checking account and certificate of deposit at Bank of Oklahoma to protect my interests. I told you I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. And then I called Diane Patterson, my lawyer, and asked her to review whether the papers you left me were what you claimed. They were not. No one moved. Somewhere behind me, one of the ladies from the bridge club stood frozen like a statue, a paper plate halfway to her mouth. The letter went on. The document you asked me to sign would have given you sole authority to withdraw funds from those accounts without my consent, and would have removed Walter from the secondary contact list the bank had kept since your father died. Diane explained to me that this was one of the most common forms of financial exploitation aimed at people my age. If I had signed without reading carefully, you would have gained legal access to nearly $200,000 of your father's and my savings, with no obligation to tell me or anyone else how or when you used it. In February 2021, I had a night with a fever so high I didn't know where I was. Walter told me I called him Frank 3 times and asked when his father was coming home from the yard. I woke up the next morning to find him sleeping in a chair, still in yesterday's clothes because he refused to leave until my fever broke. I called you the next day, Roland, and you said you were sorry you couldn't make it that week. I understood then. Now I want to write this clearly because everyone's life deserves an honest record. Even the parts that are hard to read, I didn't confront you. I want to explain why, because I think you all deserve to understand the choice I made, not just the silence that followed. I was 84 years old. I had lost my husband. I didn't want to lose my eldest son in the same decade. I told myself that if I simply refused to sign quietly without making accusations, we could continue as before, the 2 visits a year, the occasional phone call, and I could keep loving the son I always loved without forcing either of us to look directly at what you tried to do. I was wrong to protect you from that conversation, Roland. Sitting here writing this, I understand my silence allowed you to build a story in your head that Walter was the one dividing us, when the truth was that you tried to take something from me and had no idea I knew. Denise set her coffee cup down completely. Roland's face went as pale as the folded tablecloth behind him. I kept every record, the letter continued. Diane has copies of the original documents you asked me to sign, along with her written analysis of what they actually permitted. I also want you to know that Bank of Oklahoma flagged 2 separate attempts to add a co-signer to my accounts in June 2019 and March 2020 using paperwork without my authorization. I didn't pursue either legally, because I didn't want to spend my remaining years in a courtroom with my son, but I documented everything, dates, amounts, conversations, in a notebook. Diane has a copy because I decided long ago that the truth deserved to exist somewhere, even if I lacked the courage to say it to your face while I was alive to hear it. I raised my eyes from the page for just a moment. Roland was staring at the letter in my hand as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. Denise took a step back from him without realizing she was doing it. I finished reading. Walter, my mother wrote near the end, I leave the house on Zuna Street and the remainder of my estate to be divided according to the will held by Diane, which I updated in May 2019, a month after I understood what your brother tried to do. I appointed you executor because you were the one who showed up every day without needing me to say thank you. Now I am saying it. Ann Page, sweetheart, if you are standing there listening, I want you to open the smaller envelope. I watched you choose to be near me in a way your father didn't, and I don't think that should be overlooked just because you are quiet about it. There is a trust fund in your name at the same bank, quietly built over the last 4 years, dedicated to your nursing education and whatever you become after. Your grandfather would have been so proud of who you chose to be. I love you all, the letter concluded, even those for whom this is hard to hear today, especially you, because in my experience, love is never about who visits more. It is about who tells the truth when it matters. And finally, I am telling it with love, Mom. I folded the paper. No one in the room spoke for what felt like an eternity. Aunt Ruth held my hand tightly. Carol pressed her face against my chest, crying silently. Paige stood frozen, staring at the small envelope with her name on it that I had just handed her, her fingers not yet steady enough to open it. Roland finally spoke, his voice completely stripped of its composed sorrow. That was, he started, then stopped. He tried again and trailed off. I didn't yell at my brother in that reception room. I didn't need to. I just looked at him with the exact same eyes I had used 20 minutes earlier by the grave, and said quietly, "You told me I ruined this family. I let you say that, Roland, because I didn't want to turn Mom's funeral into a fight, but she just told the whole room who actually did. He had no answer. Denise left the reception about 10 minutes later alone, driving off by herself. I found out later through Paige that she moved out of their house in Scottsdale within 6 weeks. I felt it only as a quiet, heavy fatigue, the silent understanding that some truths simply take time to become clear. I called Diane Patterson the following Monday. Diane confirmed every single point in the letter and provided copies of the 2019 document Roland had asked my mother to sign, a joint account authorization form from Bank of Oklahoma that would have granted him sole withdrawal authority without notification, meaning the bank would never inform my mother or me about any transactions. She also had the notebook my mother kept afterward, containing small dated entries spanning 5 years, heartbreaking in their quiet simplicity. Roland called again today, asking about the CD. I told him I'd think about it. That was the entire entry for the 14th of June 2019. My mother had silently documented a conversation she never intended to bring up until she decided, near the end of her life, that she had to. Diane also walked me through the estate papers. The house on Zunis Avenue, valued at over $210,000, was left to me outright. The remainder of the accounts, roughly $340,000, including savings, certificates of deposit, and a modest stock portfolio my father had built step by step over 4 decades, was divided according to a formula my mother and Diane worked out in May 2019, which was never modified. Roland's share was set at $25,000, a specific bequest rather than a percentage. Diane explained that this was entirely intentional, a legal strategy ensuring no one could claim Eleanor Doss had simply forgotten to update a document. She hadn't forgotten a thing. She had made a choice. The trust fund in Paige's name, just as the letter stated, had been quietly built over consecutive years. Small, steady contributions, never large enough to stand out on monthly statements, but consistent enough that by the time my mother passed, it had grown to over $60,000, waiting for a granddaughter who had no idea it existed until she opened a small envelope in a room filled with grieving family and strangers. Paige called me 2 days later, her voice still thick with emotion. "Uncle Walt," she said, "I don't understand why she chose me. I didn't do anything special. I just liked visiting her." Standing in my shop on Peoria Avenue, looking at an unfinished rocking chair, I told her, "That is exactly why she chose you. You never did it expecting anything in return. To me, that's the only kind of love that truly matters, the kind that doesn't know it's being watched." That same week, I offered Paige something else, something that had nothing to do with money. I told her my shop was open every Saturday if she wanted to learn how to work with her hands, the way her great-grandfather and I used to do. The following weekend, she showed up with sawdust in her hair, smiling brightly for the first time since the funeral. She has come by almost every Saturday since. Watching her learn to sand a table leg down to the grain has brought me more peace than almost anything else. As for Roland, I know some of you might hope I completely cut ties with him, slammed the door, and never spoke to him again. But that wouldn't be the truth, and it is important to tell you what actually happened rather than a neater version. I didn't file a lawsuit against him. My mother made her decisions clear in writing, and I respected her wishes. Even though Diane mentioned the documents could support a legal case if I chose to pursue one, what I did was simpler, and in its own way, far harder. About 2 weeks after the funeral, I spoke to him on the phone. I told him I would always be his brother, and that I didn't want to punish him for the rest of his life for something our mother herself chose not to punish him for. But once a person understands the real cost of what they've lost, things are never quite the same. The dynamic shifts because the person has changed. I told him the door wasn't locked, but I also told him it wouldn't open on its own. He was quiet. I waited a long time on the line. Then he spoke in a voice I hadn't heard since we were boys sharing a bedroom in the house on Zunas Street, long before either of us understood what all of this would eventually cost. "I don't know how to be the man she thought I could still be, Walt." "Then start small," I told him. "That is how the rest of us do it, one Tuesday at a time." I still don't know if he will. That part of the story isn't finished yet, and I won't pretend it has a neat resolution just for the sake of an ending. What I know for sure is this: My mother spent the last 6 years of her life watching her 2 sons show her 2 very different kinds of love. One was measured in distance and vacation photos, the other was measured in Tuesday mornings that nobody took photos of. In the end, she found a way to tell the truth about both without ever raising her voice. Through pages written years ago, waiting patiently in a locked drawer for the exact moment they needed to be heard. I think about that quiet courage often now, the courage it takes to write down the truth and trust that it will reach the people who need it, even if you aren't there to say it yourself. I picture my mother at the kitchen table on Zuna Street, watching me walk in through the very door she used to look out of while narrating the neighborhood. She chose every word carefully, weighing her family's future long before any of us understood there was anything left to lose. I still drive past that house occasionally, though it belongs to someone else now, a young couple with a dog and a tricycle in the yard. I don't stop. I don't need to. Everything I needed from that house, I carried away with me in the quiet, steady memory of a woman who spent 89 years believing that showing up without needing recognition is the truest form of love a person can give. She was right about that. It just took the rest of us a little longer to understand it.